What most people misunderstand about empaths is that they don't go cold because they stopped caring. They go cold because they cared too much for too long, with too little coming back. You've probably seen it happen. Someone who used to text first, who used to notice when you were quiet, who used to absorb your bad moods without complaint, slowly stops. The warmth doesn't disappear all at once, it fades, quietly, almost politely, and by the time you notice, it's already too late to talk them out of it. Here's what nobody tells you about empaths. Their love isn't fragile, it's durable. It survives things that would break most people. Empaths forgive faster, explain away more, and give second, third, fourth chances that most people wouldn't even consider. So when an empath finally goes cold, it's never sudden. It's the end result of a long, invisible negotiation they had with themselves. One where they kept choosing you again and again, hoping you'd eventually choose them back the same way. And this is the part that stings the most. Empaths don't announce the moment they give up. There's no fight, no ultimatum, no dramatic exit. One day they just stop reaching, stop explaining, stop hoping out loud. And what looks like sudden distance is actually the final stage of a process that started months, sometimes years, earlier. The tragedy is that most people only notice the coldness. They don't notice the specific things they did to cause it. Because empaths don't go cold randomly. There are patterns, specific behaviors that chip away at their emotional safety until withdrawal becomes the only form of self-protection left. If you've ever wondered why someone who used to feel so warm now feels so distant, the answer isn't a mystery, it's a pattern. And once you understand it, you'll never misread an empath's silence again. The first thing that makes an empath go cold is being taken for granted, not in the obvious way. Not through cruelty or neglect that anyone could point to and say, that's wrong, it happens quieter than that, it happens through repetition. Through the slow, invisible process of someone's care becoming furniture in your life, something you assume will always be there, so you stop noticing it at all. Think about what an empath actually gives. They remember the small things. They ask how you're really doing, and they mean it. They sense when your voice changes, when something's off, when you need space, or when you need company, and they adjust themselves accordingly almost without thinking. This isn't a performance for them. It's instinct. It's how they're wired to move through relationships. And because it comes so naturally, it's easy for the people around them to assume it costs nothing. But it does cost something. Every single time. Here's what most people don't understand about emotional labor. It's still labor. It still drains something. It still requires energy, attention, patience, presence. An empath holding space for your bad day, your anxiety, your venting, your silence, that's work, even if it looks effortless from the outside. And when that work goes unnoticed, when it's never acknowledged, never returned, never even seen, something inside the empath starts to quietly recalibrate. At first, they don't even register it as a problem. They tell themselves it's fine. They tell themselves that's just who they are. A giver, someone who loves hard and doesn't need much back. But there's a difference between giving because you want to and giving because you've never been shown what receiving feels like. Somewhere in the relationship, if the imbalance goes on long enough, giving stops feeling like generosity and starts feeling like invisibility. This is the part that catches people off guard. They assume that because the empath never complained, everything was okay. They assume silence meant contentment. But often silence is just what depletion looks like before it turns into distance. An empath can be unraveling quietly for months while still showing up, still checking in, still asking if you're okay, because that's how deeply the pattern is wired into them. It doesn't shut off just because it isn't being reciprocated. It just gets heavier to carry. And this is where the coldness begins to form, not out of resentment exactly, but out of exhaustion. There's only so long a person can keep pouring into a space that never pours back before something in them starts to close. Not out of spite, out of self-preservation. The nervous system does what it has to do to protect itself, and eventually, giving without receiving starts to feel unsafe, even if the empath can't fully articulate why. What makes this especially painful is that the people who take empaths for granted usually aren't bad people. They're just unaware. They've simply gotten used to being taken care of, and comfort has a way of making effort invisible. It's not that they don't value the empath. It's that they've stopped noticing the weight of what's being given because it's never been asked of them to notice. But awareness isn't the same as effort. And empaths, more than almost anyone, can feel the difference between someone who appreciates them and someone who simply benefits from them. So when the warmth fades, when the empath stops initiating, stops checking in, stops offering the same depth of care they used to offer so freely, it isn't a mystery. It isn't randomness. It's the nervous system finally saying, I can't keep doing this alone. If you want to understand why someone who used to feel so present now feels distant, ask yourself honestly, did you ever notice what they were giving you? Or did you just get used to receiving it? Because the truth is simple, even if it's hard to hear. People don't just want to be loved. They want to feel like their love is seen. And the moment an empath realizes their care has become an expectation instead of something valued, that's the moment they start protecting themselves the only way they know how. By quietly stepping back, not because they stopped caring, but because they finally started caring about themselves too. Dismissing or minimizing their feelings is the second thing that makes an empath go cold, and it's often more damaging than people realize because it doesn't feel like an attack in the moment. It feels small, a shrug, a you're overreacting. Why does this even bother you? Said so casually that it barely registers as harmful. But for an empath, whose entire way of experiencing the world runs through feeling things deeply, this kind of dismissal doesn't just sting. It teaches them something dangerous, that their emotional reality isn't welcome here. Empaths don't process life the way everyone else does. They don't just observe emotion, they absorb it. Every tone shift, every unspoken tension, every flicker of sadness in someone else's eyes, they catch it all, usually before anyone has said a word. So when they finally speak up about their own feelings, it's rarely impulsive. It's rarely dramatic. It's usually the result of them holding something in far longer than they should have, working up the courage to finally say, this hurt me, or I need something different. And this is exactly the moment where so many relationships quietly start to break, because what the empath needs in that moment is simple. They need to be heard, not fixed, not debated, not corrected, just heard. But instead, what often happens is a subtle reframing. Their feelings get minimized. You're too sensitive. It's not that deep. You're making this bigger than it is. Each phrase seems small on its own, but to an empath it lands like a verdict. It tells them their internal world is inconvenient, that their emotional accuracy, the very thing that makes them so intuitive and caring toward others, is somehow a flaw when it's directed at their own needs. Here's the part most people miss. When you dismiss an empath's feelings, you're not just invalidating one moment. You're teaching them a pattern. You're showing them what happens every time they try to be vulnerable with you. And empaths learn fast. They're perceptive by nature, so they don't need this lesson repeated many times before they start adjusting their behavior around it. They stop bringing things up. They stop saying when something hurts, not because it stopped mattering, but because they've learned that expressing it doesn't lead anywhere safe. This is where the quiet erosion begins, because an empath who feels dismissed doesn't usually respond with anger. They respond with retreat. They start filtering themselves. They start deciding what's worth mentioning and what isn't, and slowly, without announcing it, they begin editing themselves out of the relationship. The version of them you see becomes smaller, more guarded, less honest, not because they've changed who they are, but because they've stopped trusting you with who they are. And this is the tragic irony. The very sensitivity that makes empaths so attuned to other people's pain is the same sensitivity that gets punished when it's turned inward. People expect empaths to be endlessly understanding of everyone else's emotions, yet grow impatient the moment the empath needs the same understanding in return. That imbalance doesn't go unnoticed. It gets stored quietly beneath the surface, shaping how safe the empath feels being open with you. Eventually, something shifts. The empath stops testing the waters. They stop bringing up what bothers them, not because they've resolved it internally, but because they've decided it's easier, safer, less painful to simply carry it alone. And when that happens, The emotional intimacy that once made the relationship feel close begins to fade. Not through conflict, but through silence, through absence, through an empath quietly deciding that vulnerability with you no longer feels worth the risk. This is why so many people are blindsided when an empath suddenly seems distant or unreachable. They don't realize that distance was built one dismissed feeling at a time, one moment where you're overreacting replaced real listening, one instance where minimizing was easier than understanding. Because in the end, empaths don't need you to feel everything they feel. They just need you to make room for it. And when that room disappears, so does their willingness to show you who they really are underneath the surface. Inconsistent effort is the third thing that quietly kills an empath's warmth, and it's one of the hardest patterns to recognize from the inside because it doesn't look like neglect. It looks like love. Sometimes it looks like attention, sometimes. The problem isn't the absence of care. The problem is the unpredictability of it, the way affection shows up only when it's convenient, only when the mood strikes, only when there's nothing easier to focus on instead. Think about what this does to someone over time. 1 week you're fully present, attentive, warm, texting first, asking questions, making them feel like the center of your world. Then the next week, nothing, silence, distraction, a version of you that feels like a stranger compared to who you were just days before. To most people, this might seem like normal ebb and flow, the natural rhythm of life getting busy. But to an empath, someone whose nervous system is constantly scanning for emotional safety, this inconsistency doesn't read as normal. It reads as instability. Empaths don't need constant intensity. They don't need you to be perfect or endlessly available. What they need is predictability. They need to know that your care isn't dependent on your mood, your convenience, or what else is competing for your attention that day. Because when affection becomes something that appears and disappears without warning, the empath is forced into a role they never agreed to, emotional detective. They start analyzing your behavior, trying to figure out what triggered the shift, wondering if they did something wrong, wondering if they're asking for too much simply by wanting consistency. This is exhausting in a way that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't lived it. Because it's not the low moments that break an empath, it's the unpredictability between the highs and lows. It's never knowing which version of you they're going to get, so they start bracing themselves, protecting themselves, softening their expectations before you even have the chance to disappoint them. And here's what makes this especially painful: inconsistent effort sends a message, whether it's intended or not. It tells the empath that their needs are conditional, that they matter when it's easy and they don't when it's not, that love here isn't a steady presence. It's a reward that shows up occasionally, unpredictably, on someone else's terms. Over time, this teaches the empath something devastating. It teaches them not to rely on you. Not because they don't want to, but because relying on inconsistency only leads to disappointment. What's tragic is that empaths are usually the ones who show up the same way every single time. Rain or shine, good mood or bad, they remain steady, dependable, present. So when they're met with the opposite, when their consistency is met with someone else's unpredictability, it creates an imbalance that eventually becomes unbearable. It's not that they can't handle imperfection. Everyone has off days. It's that they can't build safety on top of uncertainty. And without safety, connection can't survive. So they start adjusting. Quietly, gradually, they stop expecting as much. They stop getting excited when things are good because they've learned good moments don't last. They stop being surprised when the warmth disappears again because now they've seen the pattern enough times to know it's coming. This is where the coldness begins, not because they've stopped caring, but because they've stopped hoping for consistency that never comes. Eventually, something in them shifts permanently. They stop chasing the version of you that only shows up sometimes. They stop waiting for the good days to return, and they start protecting their own energy instead, because depending on someone who's only present when it suits them isn't love. It's uncertainty dressed up as connection. And once an empath learns that lesson, they rarely go back to hoping for something steadier. They simply stop investing in something that was never fully there to begin with. Repeatedly crossing boundaries is the fourth thing that pushes an empath toward coldness, and it's often the most misunderstood because on the surface, it doesn't look like betrayal. It looks like closeness. It looks like someone who just doesn't quite get it, who pushes a little too far, who asks for a little too much, who assumes access where none was granted. But underneath that surface, something far more damaging is happening. Every time a boundary gets crossed and nothing changes, the empath learns a lesson they never wanted to learn, that their limits don't actually hold weight in this relationship. Empaths often struggle to set boundaries in the first place. It goes against their nature. Their instinct is to accommodate, to understand, to give people the benefit of the doubt, to bend before they break. So when an empath finally does set a boundary, when they say, I need space, or please don't do that, or this doesn't work for me, it's rarely a small thing. It's usually the result of real internal effort, a moment where they overrode their instinct to just absorb the discomfort silently, and instead spoke up for themselves. This is why it matters so much what happens next. When that boundary gets ignored, whether through carelessness or through repeated testing, something breaks that's hard to repair. It's not just about the specific boundary itself. It's about what the violation represents. It tells the empath that their voice doesn't carry consequence, that they can express their needs clearly, and it still won't change anything. And for someone who already struggles to advocate for themselves, this is devastating. It reinforces the very fear that made setting the boundary so hard in the first place. That speaking up doesn't matter. Here's what makes this pattern especially corrosive. Boundaries aren't just rules. They're a form of communication about what safety looks like for that person. When someone repeatedly crosses them, intentionally or not, they're not just overstepping a preference. They're signaling again and again that the empath's sense of safety isn't a priority. And empaths, being as perceptive as they are, pick up on this signal fast. They start to feel it before they can even articulate it. A tightening, a hesitation, a growing distance that even they might not fully understand at first. What often happens next is heartbreaking in its simplicity. The empath stops setting boundaries altogether, not because they no longer need them, but because they've learned that asking doesn't lead anywhere. So instead of continuing to advocate for themselves only to be ignored again, they simply withdraw. They create distance on their own terms, quietly, without asking permission, because that distance has become the only boundary they trust will actually be respected. This is a critical shift to understand. When an empath stops setting boundaries and instead starts pulling away, it's not because they've become passive. It's because they've become protective. Distance becomes their new boundary, one that doesn't require anyone else's cooperation to enforce. They don't need you to respect it because they're the one controlling it now. And this is where the coldness sets in, not as punishment, but as self-preservation. An empath who has had their limits ignored again and again eventually stops explaining themselves. They stop hoping their needs will be understood. They stop offering access to their inner world because every time they did, that access was treated as negotiable rather than something to be honored. What's especially painful here is that this shift often looks like the empath simply changing. People notice the distance and wonder what happened without realizing the real answer. Nothing happened suddenly. It was a slow accumulation of moments where their word wasn't enough to create change until eventually they stopped using their words at all. Because in the end, boundaries aren't really about control. They're about trust, whether or not someone can trust that their limits will be honored. And once that trust breaks, no amount of apology can fully undo what silence and distance now protect far more reliably than words ever did. Never reciprocating emotional vulnerability is the fifth and final thing that pushes an empath into coldness, and it might be the deepest wound of all because it isn't about one bad moment or one careless mistake. It's about a pattern that stretches across the entire relationship, the empath always being the one who listens and never the one who's truly known in return. Empaths are natural emotional anchors. People come to them with their fears, their confusion, their pain, and the empath receives it all without flinching. They ask the right questions. They sit in silence when silence is needed. They hold space for things most people wouldn't know how to hold. This is their gift. But it's also quietly their vulnerability, because the same openness they offer so freely to others is rarely offered back to them in equal measure. Think about what it means to be someone's safe place without ever having a safe place of your own. Think about what it does to a person to constantly be the one who understands while rarely being the one who's understood. This is the invisible imbalance so many empaths live inside of. They know exactly how you feel, what you're struggling with, what keeps you up at night. But when it's their turn to be vulnerable, when they try to share their own fears or uncertainties, the depth isn't returned. The conversation shifts. The moment passes. The emotional intimacy that felt so natural when it flowed toward you suddenly becomes awkward, uncomfortable, or entirely absent when it's supposed to flow back. This isn't always intentional. Often the people around empaths simply aren't used to being asked to go deeper. They're comfortable receiving depth, but not necessarily comfortable providing it. And because empaths are so skilled at making emotional labor look effortless, most people never realize how one-sided the exchange has become. They don't ask themselves, when was the last time I really opened up to them? Because it's never been demanded of them. The empath never demanded it. They just kept giving, hoping that depth would eventually become mutual. But here's the quiet truth about connection: it cannot survive on one-sided vulnerability forever. Real intimacy requires exposure from both sides. It requires risk from both people, not just one. When only one person is doing the emotional heavy lifting, when only one person is showing up fully seen while the other remains guarded, comfortable, unexamined, the relationship starts to feel less like partnership and more like caretaking, and caretaking, no matter how much love is behind it, eventually becomes exhausting when it isn't reciprocated. This is where the H begins to grow. Not dramatic heartbreak, but a slow, persistent loneliness, the kind that exists even in the middle of connection. Because being unseen while constantly seeing others is one of the most isolating experiences a person can carry. The empath starts to wonder if they're valued for who they are, or simply for what they provide. They start to feel like a resource rather than a person, someone whose emotional depth is welcomed only when it's useful, and quietly avoided when it might require the same depth in return. Over time, something inside them begins to close, not out of bitterness, but out of quiet self-protection. If vulnerability isn't met with vulnerability, if openness isn't met with openness, they start to hold back the parts of themselves that were never truly received in the first place. They stop initiating deep conversations. They stop sharing what's really going on beneath the surface. Not because they've lost the capacity for depth, but because they've learned that offering it here doesn't lead to closeness. It leads to a wall they can feel but never quite name. And this is perhaps the loneliest form of distance there is, the kind that exists not because someone stopped caring, but because they never felt like their inner world mattered as much as everyone else's did. Empaths don't need someone who mirrors their emotional intensity perfectly. They simply need someone willing to meet them halfway, someone who understands that being fully known works both ways. Because in the end, an empath doesn't grow cold from lack of love. They grow cold from lack of reciprocity, from years of being the safe place for everyone else, while quietly wondering who was ever meant to be theirs.